As a reminder, I think all of you know, right? We had a few equity audits. We had the ability challenge audit. We have looked at disproportionality and opportunity gaps within our data. We have talked as both a leadership team and with staff and faculty. What are equity needs? What are we seeing as needs? And then also have gotten feedback based on lived experiences of those in our community, learners, caregivers, faculty and staff, family members. So when creating and drafting this plan, it was very much created based on the feedback, right? I by no means just pulled up in my office and decided to write a plan, right? It was very much situated in the feedback that we've gotten. In addition to that, I've started to do feedback cycles. So I've gotten some feedback from like the middle school teachers. So Biba has already seen this presentation and has gotten some feedback from instructional assistants. I was able to spend some time with some students last week and creating some plans too to get student feedback. So really thinking about how do we ensure that we're having cycles of feedback for this living document, knowing that it'll sort of be a perpetual draft that we are constantly revising based on our needs, and also really centering the voices of the most marginalized in our community in order to make sure that we're uplifting and making space for those voices, and those are directly informing this work. So we have 5 goal areas. These are the big buckets that as an admin team, we felt like sort of encompassed the big areas of the feedback that we've gotten. So what we did was looked at the feedback from the equity audit, feedback from faculty and staff, all of the feedback that I listed on the previous slide, and thought about how do we represent these in different buckets of work to start to organize some of this work. So you'll see we have 5 specific goal areas: foundational and collective understanding of anti-racism and equity. That's really around what is the basic anti-racism and equity knowledge that we need, right? So what are the things about our identities and the bias? How do we reflect on those in order to do this work? Understanding of how oppression manifests within the public school system, right? All of those are really foundational if we're going to move together as a community to do this work. Then thinking about learner experiences and outcomes. So what is our system producing? What outcomes for students, and how do we break those down by demographics to see the equity implications? Really thinking about how do we ensure we're fostering belonging and community across those in our community, right? Across learners, faculty and staff, community members. Thinking about accessibility and inclusion of our spaces, of our curriculum, et cetera. And then thinking about transparency and accountability. How do we measure and track this work and make sure that we're doing it in a way that is accessible and available so folks can help us keep track of this really important work. So each of these, so we have the 5 goal areas. For each of these goal areas, we are looking to break down each goal area into 3 really specific goals. So bear with me. I'm going to try to explain this in a way that's clear, right? So for example, if we have foundational and collective understanding of anti-racism and equity, we are going to have a goal around the individual experience, right? We'll have a goal under foundational and collective understanding around our systems work and tending to the systems needs. And then we'll also have a goal around skills and knowledge. Through doing that, we're trying to get sort of a multifaceted approach that thinks about the individuals, our big systems, really thinking about the institutional and interactional equity pieces, and then also what are the things that people need to know and know how to do in order to really do this work, right? So each of these 5 goal areas in the draft you'll see has an individual experience, a systems goal, and a skills and knowledge goal. And then under each of these goals, we have like a what, a why, and a how, right? So the what is to really clarify, what is this goal? What does it entail? The why is this important? How does this directly relate to anti-racism and equity? And then the how, or what are the specific action items that we're going to make sure that we're doing in order to make progress on this goal. And then there's also this, and how are we make sure this happening, really speaking to the need for accountability and tracking this work over time to make sure that this doesn't just become a nicely written document that is public, but is also something that we're constantly tending to and really centering this work to make sure that equity then becomes a piece, a major piece, and foundational to the work that we're doing across the district. So some preview of some of the action items if you didn't have time to read the draft, right? So thinking about sort of smaller scale things like how do we make sure that we have an incident response outline? So if an incident of harm happens, that we have a consistent and known and expected way to tend to that. Thinking about school-based collective commitments. So how are we going to think about how we treat each other, especially when we're having harder conversations? To culturally responsive caregiver communication guidelines. What does partnering with families look like? What does that look like when we're doing so in a culturally responsive way? To increasing equity training and professional development for all staffs. And then all the way to sort of the major work that Libby is leading for us, really thinking about how do we create an instructional framework that is inclusively designed, that's asset-based, that's culturally responsive. So how do we shift our teaching across the district, knowing that it is very much happening in a lot of ways across our teachers who are very skilled, right? Many of them are doing this work, but how do we do this in a way that becomes part of our system so we can guarantee that everyone in our district is teaching in a way that is culturally responsive, asset-based, et cetera. And then thinking about translation and of course, how do we diversify our faculty and staff across our district as a major piece as well. So you may be thinking, how do we track this, right? Which is a really fair question. And I think something that is really challenging when we're thinking about anti-racism and equity work. So two of the ways that we're playing with and diving into, and I know we've talked to you all about disproportionality and the opportunity gap. And these are two ways that we can look at mostly our institutional or systems work that we're doing and what is the impact of our work on our systems and how is it then impacting student experience. So we're on the left side, we're thinking about disproportionality. As a reminder, that's the over or underrepresented representation of students of a particular identity or demographic, right? So Libby, if you click one more time, again, love the animations, thank you. Right, so that looks like, for example, students eligible for free and reduced lunch are more likely to require tier 3 academic services here at MRPS. So we know because of our systems, right, students who are free and reduced lunch are less likely to be at the grade level proficiency and therefore overrepresented in the students who are accessing tier 3 services, right? So that's one example of disproportionality and how we can use it to see what are the impacts of our system and how do we tune them and shift them to make sure that whether you are a student with free and reduced lunch or not, you are reaching academic proficiency based on our system. And versus the opportunity gap, which is one way to measure the differences in outcomes. And again, I provided an example if you want to click one more time. So this helps measure the differences between particular demographics or lived experiences. So for example, belonging across our district for students accessing special education, 59% of those students report high levels of belonging in our district versus students who don't access special education, and this is district-wide, 69% of students report high levels of belonging, right? So our opportunity gap in that is 10%, right? And again, we use the term opportunity gap versus something like the achievement gap because it makes sure that we're continuing to look for root causes. We're thinking about our system rather than blaming the individual student for not being able to feel like in this case, they belong within our system. Okay, did a lot of talking at you. So I have a question for you all now, right? So anti-racism and equity work is going to be ongoing, right? Particularly as educators, we constantly will be looking to expand, shift, nuance, complicate our understanding of anti-racism and equity work. So last animation of the night, there is board policy about equity that talks about needing an annual training. So I would just encourage you all, you often ask us, what can you all do? So I would ask you all to think about what are the trainings that you all want as you think about this work, as you think about your place in our equity plan. What's the training that you all need or want or think would help you with this work? Okay.
Questions? Comments? Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Scott.
I really appreciate the last animation and the question embedded within it. I'm wondering, and try this again. Mia, maybe, and Lynn, maybe what we could do is have a conversation in our equity committee meeting about what, and maybe even invite you to join us for a conversation about what are the things that would be helpful for us as a board to get a better understanding of.
I think that's a good idea. I first wanted to just say thank you because this is a great deal of work. The presentation didn't even scratch the surface. I'm glad that the report or the plan, the draft plan is accessible to the public just in, if you can find it in the, meeting documents for today's meeting. And it's because it's huge. It's just huge. It's a ton of work to have sifted through all those different areas that we got feedback in. And this is the very first time that our district has a roadmap of this kind, which we've wanted for a very long time. So and I can think of no better time than now, given the current events, for us to be fostering an environment where everybody feels like they belong and people are fully understanding the weight of racism in the history of our country. So I'm really glad that this exists, and I thank you very much for spearheading it. And I especially loved all the detail on within those areas of focus for the goals on who is responsible for them and how it's going to happen, because that is what should it exist in a plan. So that's what's going to take this from our aspirations and our intentions and put it really into action. So that was my first thing, because I just really wanted to say thank you for this. I have a couple of questions of curiosities. You mentioned that the plan is drafted using feedback from lots of different areas, like in your iterations of the plan, including caregivers. And I'm curious what method you use to get feedback from caregivers on the plan itself, because I know a lot of caregiver feedback informed the plan from those other sources, but as you were drafting the plan.
Yeah, I haven't had an opportunity to do that.
Okay, that's coming up
quite
next.
yet,
I see.
and that is part of the plan as well. When thinking about the equity plan, it felt like it was important to start with teachers and gain that understanding of it and get feedback from there before I threw it out to the entire community.
Yeah.
And that is not to underscore the importance of caregiver feedback as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if folks have.
Great. I'll be really, really interested and excited to hear what we learned from caregivers about the plan. And then I noticed that there's a real focus on anti-racism, and I totally understand it. I also am curious about how students, for example, students who receive free and reduced lunch, or students living in poverty, how does that, there's not a whole lot of language addressing the needs of those students in this plan. So how does that work into the plan?
Yeah, so one of the things I think we talked about quite a bit in drafting this plan is thinking about, do we specifically name individual groups of marginalized identities and tend to their needs, or do we think about it more as an overarching plan, knowing that if we, for example, create instruction that is more accessible to multilingual learners, we will then also be addressing and making it more accessible for students with disabilities, for students who are accessing free and reduced lunch. So that was an intentional choice around, instead of specifically naming particular groups of folks and their needs, thinking about it more as an all-encompassing, as we strengthen and create a more inclusive instruction, as we create more sense of belonging across, we know that that will increase and support all students. And with that, right, we know that we're going to be looking at disproportionality and the opportunity gap based on demographics and lived experiences. So we can track that over time and think about how do we then respond, knowing if our opportunity gap doesn't decrease, right, then we can think about how do we specifically target particular groups based on their unique needs.
Okay,
Makes sense.
I think so. I think what I hear you saying is that throughout the plan, you refer to students and in some cases staff with historically marginalized identities. And the way we can think about that then is students who are living in poverty we definitely, as a society, marginalize poor people. So
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
got it. Okay.
Tried to specifically use the umbrella term.
Okay.
And also I didn't want to accidentally leave any group out or overrepresent one and underrepresent and then have some unintended messaging. So thinking about using that umbrella term was intentional.
Thanks.
But that's a fair question, one that I'm very open to feedback on if anybody has any.
I have other questions, but they're more detail-y, and I just hope we have you back to talk more about it. We don't have
I think
to,
that's the plan.
we don't have to
yes.
get them and get all of my questions answered tonight.
I think that we also, I mean, we have the equity committee, as Scott, I don't mean to point at Scott as he's shoveling food in his mouth, but we do have the equity committee, and that might be a good spot to do a deeper dive that Jess and I can come to.
Great.
Excellent. Any other questions? Comments? No, thank you, Jess. It's great work and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Would you like some chocolate?
I've eaten a lot of chocolate. So I'll be
All, the
honest.
chocolate is for all.
The predicted budget pressures and priorities, which I know we are all
You're waiting.
aware of.
All right. So tonight is kind of the first go at FY26 budget seasons. It's a little bit different than what has traditionally happened at the school board meeting. Traditionally, Christina would be taking that seat right there and saying to the board, what do you think the community can stand? And this is what we see as pressures. So we have a little bit more detail for the board tonight because we're predicting that FY26 will be another very hard budget season. So just a reminder to the board and the community, this is our timeline. I recognize some of those are small, so I apologize to those in the audience who don't have this in front of them. But tonight is the kickoff. We're talking about pressures and priorities. Our administration is already working on the FY26 budget behind the scenes. We're in the very beginning process of developing that first draft to show you at the first board meeting in December. So whatever date that is, December 3rd. Next board meeting, we'll be talking with our dear friend Anna about a communications plan, because that is another area that we are ramping up this year and doing in a much different and intentional way than we have in years past, which I think based on the false narratives that were running around town last year across the state, I think that's very needed this year to try to avoid that as much as possible. So in December, the board will see two different drafts. The very first draft, you'll give us feedback. We will do revisions in between those meetings. The second meeting in December, you get a second draft based on the revisions. Oftentimes we get more exact numbers between those two drafts. So that's another place that we get revisions. And then the first meeting in January is the third draft, where it's pretty well done. Not completely cooked, but there's still time to do a little bit of revision in there. And then by the second board meeting in January, that's when the board has to make a decision to approve the budget, because we need that much time to get it over to our town clerks in order to get it warned and all that kind of good stuff. So this is just the timeline. And then we'll have a public informational meeting on March 3rd, and town meeting this year is on March 4th. So a little bit of overview for the board and the community. When we're talking about Vermont's educational finance system, we are talking about an incredibly complicated finance system, possibly. As somebody, a national presenter said the other day, we don't usually say states are unique because they all think they're unique. No, Vermont's unique in how we finance education. We have revenue that comes into our education fund from things like sales and use tax, property taxes, that kind of thing. And then with the education fund, there's some of that money that we never see because there's uses that come out of the education fund that don't come directly to schools. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's, of course, education spending, which is what all the boards across the state of Vermont decide they need for education spending. That all goes into one big pot and then is split out from there. And Jake, if I misspeak in any way, shape, or form, I have the privilege of having an expert on my board or on this, or Jill. So if I misspeak in any way or you want to add in, please do. So the use of the education fund. So it does fund education, of course. It also funds universal school meals. So that money never actually comes to us. It's just funding it outside of us. It also funds early college tuition. So that was a statute change a few years ago. So it funds that early college. Kids actually de-enroll, if that's a word. They disenroll from Montpelier High School. So they're no longer considered our students. And the education fund pays for their first year of college or whatever, and then they re-enroll right before graduation so that we give them a diploma. It also has after-school funding coming out of the education fund. And then it has had PCB mitigation remediation, and that money is now all used up because of all the PCBs that have been found in schools. And so that did come off the top of the education fund. But it's all used up what the legislature has set aside for that in the education fund. So now that shifts to local budgets. So if we move over to the cost shifts to local budgets, the state has pretty much level funded mental health needs of children and families. And we have seen a significant rise in mental health costs in our school budget because of that maintaining that the state has decided. We are really, in Montpelier here in particular, the only game in town for mental health services for many of our students. So we have a lot of social workers, we have a lot of counselors, we have a lot of services that we provide kids in-house. Our vouchers to private pre-K comes out of our local budgets, which is a pretty large expense. All our facilities needs, I say that's a shift. It's not a recent shift. But when the legislature decided to stop using state funding for school construction grants, that shifted all to us, right? So that is a shift to local budgets, just not a recent one. And now that PCB mitigation and remediation, if the way the law is currently, as of today, if we were to find any PCBs in this building, then we would be on the hook for any mitigation and remediation needs. So that is shifted to the local budget at a significant cost, not a small one, a significant cost. We're not actually going to watch this, but if you haven't seen, and if the community hasn't watched this, our friend Lola Dufort over at Vermont Public put together this great video as the education finance. It's Lola in cartoon. It's really good. It's really easy to watch. So we just wanted to make sure that it was on that, and we'll make sure that it's on any budget webpage we have too, because it's pretty well done. Just a reminder of Act 127, we're still there. So last year, the weights changed for how they calculate our per pupil expenditures. And that had significant impact on Montpelier-Roxbury. We're now in year 2 of using these weights. And just a reminder that the significant changes came to students qualifying for free and reduced lunch and multilingual learners. MRPS numbers in those 2 areas have not significantly changed from last year. And in fact, our October 1 counts has some decreases in multilingual learners. We will receive an 8 cent tax decrease. Last year, it was 10 cent tax decrease when the legislature did all that stuff at the way end of the budget year to try to fix some mistakes in the law. So that's just a really brief overview of 127, but we all do not need to relive that experience from last year. Not tonight, no. This is just a chart to give the board a sense of where we stand in terms of our per pupil expenditure in comparison to others in the state. So if I know it's really small from the board, from the screen's perspective, hopefully people can see it at home a little better. That first yellow line is Harwood. Harwood's at over 15,000 per pupil. The next blue line that's highlighted, I just highlighted, I had Christina highlight some central Vermont places around us that we're often compared to. Stowe is just under 15,000 with 14,800. And then the next line down is Washington Central. They're at 14,380 per pupil expenditure. And then that next line down is us, Montpelier-Roxbury. We're at 13,754 per pupil. The black line down below the middle there is the statewide average. The statewide average is 12,881. And then way down in the purple is Payne Mountain, which is Williamstown and Northfield. They spend 11,641 per pupil, and Barry down below that is 11,036
Per weighted pupil.
per weighted pupil.
Not
Yes.
actual.
Yep. Thank you. Yep.
Thank
Per
you.
weighted pupil. So we're up there. We're not as high up there as other school districts around us, or all the school districts around us, but we're pretty up there. If I had Christina pull out the lines right below MRPS, they would be school districts like Mount Mansfield, Essex Westford, South Burlington. These places have a much larger student population than we do, and they spend about the same as we do per weighted pupil. Any questions on this one?
No, it's helpful.
Kind of a fun slide.
I find it very helpful, and it's interesting to see how, while we are many lines above the state average, we're not that far to the right of the state average. Interesting.
Yeah, we're kind of on the high end of the average.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, in the way the data are presented, it exaggerates the difference, right? So the graph is not from 0 to 19,000, it's
No.
from 7. And so if you actually graphed it from 0, the difference, the absolute difference is only, like 10% maybe
Mhm.
higher, which is telling and helpful.
It's another interesting fact. It's just a fun fact that my brain is full of in budget season, but the bottom 4 lines are districts that do not have schools at all. So they don't have any schools, and the 5th line is the first district that does have school buildings, and it's Franklin Northeast. Enosburg is the 5th line. Just a fun fact. Not for Enosburg, but. So just in general, this is very general. We'll go into much more specifics in the first draft. But this is just very general, taken from our FY25 numbers, how our budget is broken up, just so the board gets ready for where you have the most control here. Salaries and benefits takes up 75% of our budget. Buildings and grounds is 10%. Teaching resources, so that's curricular resources, technology, all of that kind of stuff that a teacher needs and uses, is 10%. Transportation is 3%, and co-curriculars is 2%. So if we're going to take a closer look at that salary and benefits, I love how Christina used orange and blue for my Syracuse University colors. Thank you very much. Salaries is over 16 million, and then benefits is 7 million. And then if we break that salary and benefits up even more, so this is salary and benefits combined again, the big green are our teachers. So we spend over $11 million in salary and benefits for teachers. The next largest category, that's 67% of our salary and benefits line. The next largest categories are 8%, which is licensed administrators and instructional assistants. Will take up about 8% of the budget. And then we start getting into smaller pots. Our support staff, which are kind of our administrative assistants in that kind of position, take up 7% of our budget. And the custodial staff takes up 5%. non-licensed administrators, and that position is like the custodial supervisor or our community liaison, people who play more of an administrative role. However, do not have any license attached to their position. That's what that is. It's 3% of our budget. And then there was one more, and then substitutes are about 1%. And then others like food service. And right, that's what you put in the other bucket, right? Mm. That kind of thing. So it's just an interesting look of like, that's most of our budget right there. That's where we have most of our money, and how that's broken up. So this is a historical perspective of what we've done over the past few years. And I want to just make the statement before anybody really digs into this, is that when you look at the tax rates, so much goes into what makes that tax rates. It's not just an even Steven, like this is what the school spent and therefore this is what the tax rate is. It depends on the CLA and it depends on what the dollar yield was that year. It depends on lots of factors, the different weighting systems, so just bear that in mind. But we went back a few years to find out what the budget was. So what was our education spending essentially for these years? So you can see that we've increased between 3% and last year was our high at 6.9% increase. That's when the weights changed. It also, if we remember, tanked the dollar yield, which doesn't help us in terms of tax rate. So that's what the history has been. Right now, Christina has some just numbers in that are not exact, and there's a lot of assumptions made, and we don't know what the dollar yield is, and we don't know what anything else is really that the state has to give us. But when she just calculates no additions, no reductions, just salary and benefit expectations and assumptions, then already we're at a 5.2% increase to our budget without having done anything. Not adding, not subtracting, nothing. We're at a 5.2%. So last year, our 6.9% equaled a 15% tax increase here in Montpelier. So we can predict that a 5% increase is probably going to be up there as well if we don't make any other changes. And that's not, I don't mean to scare people with that number. It's just the reality of where we are right now. Here's just the same tax rate history on a line graph. So you can see the lighter blue is Montpelier and the darker blue is Roxbury. Just so you can see those and how they look over time. Our enrollment projection, as I told the board in previous board meetings, we were having a group called NESDEC do enrollment projections. They do enrollment projections for lots of districts across the state, including our neighbors at Washington Central. And Stephen Dellinger-Pate over at Washington Central told me that they've been off over the last 10 years by 3 kids. So their enrollment projections are pretty good. And this is their first go around with us. So of course they don't have any real historical data here, but other than what we've provided with actual numbers. So they are going to do it again. But this is actually pretty good news for us. Our enrollment is staying relatively steady. They're predicting our enrollment is staying relatively steady. What's not in here, and granted, I was reading a Bridge article today, which wasn't hopeful, but what's not in here is any kind of building that Montpelier might have planned either. So any kind of housing that might be built at Country Club, over on the Country Club property or anything, if that ever happens, that's not part of these calculations. It's not considered here. So our enrollment right now is looking pretty steady. So over the next 3 years, NESDEC did say that the next 3 years are pretty solid numbers. And our kindergarten through grade 8 is projected to remain stable, while our grades 9 through 12 are expected to lose just a few kids, about 28. Yeah, the bubble's going through. Go ahead, Jim.
It looks like we're gonna lose 24 kids next year. Is that in the green bar chart?
Right here. That's the prediction from NESDEC.
Is that, do you feel like that's accurate?
It's really hard to state because you get kids moving in, you get kids moving out. And so it's really hard to state exactly if that's going to be a good one. It's a probably good ballpark. Yeah.
And you were just saying on the next slide, they said we would lose over the next 3 years about 28 students.
From 9 through 12. And that K through 8 will remain relatively stable.
So can you go back to the bar chart for a sec? So, right, I think that is what is also on these bars, essentially the 28
essentially.
over the next 3 years.
With a big drop next year, according to them.
According to them. We'll see.
Which is painful, because our taxes are based on per pupil spending, so if you drop a bunch of kids in 1 year, that really is
It hurts.
hard.
Yeah, it hurts. So the highest confidence is in the projection in the next 3 years. They're gonna come in because we're new to NASDAQ. They're gonna come in at the spring to see what our numbers are in the spring. And then they'll do a projection for us next year as well. It's a relatively small cost for really good information.
Is the 24-25 actual, like, is that October?
That's our October
official
1
number?
count, yes.
And is that actual people, or is that the weighted?
This is actual people,
Good question.
butts and seats.
Got it.
Yep.
To Jake's point about about the drop in enrollment, this October student count, is that the count that is used for next fiscal years?
For FY 26, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
So it'll be the following year budget that we'll see that.
And how does that number compare to the one we had for the current year budget, the 11?
Oh, good question.
Christina's on it.
It's knowable.
Yeah, it is knowable. I'll keep going. Christina will shout it out at us. Is that okay, Tim?
Yes, right. Thank you.
Okay. I do think, I just want to reiterate, our enrollment projection for NASDAQ turned out better than I thought it would. Like, we're gonna remain pretty stable, and that's good news. So predicted budget pressures that we can predict as of right now. Last year told us that we couldn't predict everything, but as of right now, these are the ones we know. We're in negotiations with our teachers, the MREA, and instructional assistants, which are MRESSA. So anytime you have negotiations, you know that salaries are going to increase. Jason just texted me saying we enrolled 4 new students today.
Wait, it's after October 1.
I know, it's after October 1. So we need to keep them until next October 1. 1105.
Oh, this
So
is
we're up
bigger.
20. So that's good news for our, I mean,
Hopefully they are secondary multilingual students. They give
All high
they
school
give us the
students.
best ways.
All high school students.
Okay. So, oh, sorry. Yeah, good. Thank you, Miriam, for making them feel like they belong, because I'm sure you did. So another predicted budget pressure is the continued influence of the new weights on the MRPS pupils, because we weren't an advantage system under Act 127.
But would that be like a further harm this year, or should that all have happened already?
The major harm happened last year, but it's still something like, we're not on a trend line from before 127, right? We're on a new trend line, a new normal for what our per pupil will be. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Like, whereas before our weighted pupil may have been here before 127, and last year, let's say it was here. Right? Or maybe it's the other way. But now our lines are going at different.
We're on a new line.
Yeah.
A lower line.
A lower
compared to
line,
the
yeah.
rest of the
Yeah,
state.
the lower line would be right. Yeah.
But I think, Jake, what you're asking is like, that big shift happened last year. We're not gonna see another big shift. The line itself isn't gonna.
Right. We shouldn't
Go
go
upwards.
We shouldn't see that. Yeah. It will just be influenced by the number of kids we have. And
Right.
what their weights are.
Yep.
Dollar yield projections, they're doing, and I'll look at Jill for this, they're doing a different calculation of magic math for the CLA, which will influence the dollar yield, which I've asked multiple business managers, including my own, to explain to me a few times, and I'm still not quite understanding it, but I think I need to just see it. Jake's nodding his head at me, so he agrees with that assessment.
Yeah, it's gonna do some wild stuff.
Wild good or wild bad?
Wild good or wild bad?
Yeah.
Wild complicated to
wild.
think about.
Complicated to think about.
Lower dollar yield is what I understand.
Our CLA is gonna actually go up a lot. And normally you'd say, that's great, CLA is going up, but that's gonna be coupled with the dollar yield going down a lot.
And the idea is to make like the school district tax rates that we work with more similar to the actual tax rates that people see on their bills. So it's kind of take CLA dropping out of the calculation. But the yield is gonna go down because of that.
Good times. Our healthcare increase has come in at 11.9%. So we were originally predicting this number to be 16%. So it was a weird day that we were all celebrating it being 11.9% increase, but we were celebrating it because everybody was predicting 16, 17% increase. And then also I think a pressure that we have is the statewide narrative regarding cost containment for school budgets. Out of our governing body for the state, it's all about cost containment. It's not about all the things that are causing the costs to rise that schools have no control over, like mental health services to students, like PCB mitigation, like all of these things are things that the schools are now responsible for because we can't say no to kids. Our doors are wide open to whoever walks in and we need to support them the best we can. And so when the statewide narrative is all about cost containment without talking about the pressures that are causing the costs to rise so significantly, that puts a pressure on us as an administrative body and as a school board.
Olivia, before you move on to the next one, just as a reminder, I think everybody on the board knows this, but maybe folks listening, the healthcare costs is not anything that the district negotiates. It's negotiated at the state
Yeah.
level.
Thank you. I
So
meant to say
that number is, there's nothing we can do about that number.
Yeah,
Right.
that's given to us.
Healthcare increase.
Yeah, thank you, Mia. I meant to say that. So the administrative team has talked about lots of priorities and how we were going to make decisions moving into this budget process. I mean, we're in a completely different world of how we're actually designing our school budget. We used to all sit around the table and it was actually like super fun. And we'd say like, put every idea up on the board and where are we going? And like, it was a chance for us to dream and innovate and all that kind of stuff. That's not where we are right now. And we're having very hard conversations as an administrative team regarding how do we create a budget that's responsible for our taxpayers and maintain services to kids. Those two things are a little bit at odds. So if we're maintaining resources our priority is to maintain resources for effective MTSS model and SEL and academics. That is a priority. So we won't be touching that. And we want to abide by the MRPS class size policy. The board is monitoring the class size policy today. You'll see that I wrote that we are in non-compliance, particularly here at the high school, with our class size policy. So that is a conversation that we're having as an administrative team, and we also need to have it as a school board. We'll be looking at the educational quality standards. So one way we kicked off our administrative conversation around budgeting is by looking at the education quality standards, which are our have-tos, and to make sure that we have those have-tos covered financially and with human resources. Or are we over or are we under in certain areas? Because that's a document that we have to abide by. And then research-backed guidelines for staffing levels. So both the EQS and our class size policy have class size numbers in them. As you know, you can see in my monitoring report, they're a little bit different between the EQS and our class size policy, which is neither here nor there really. They're not that different. The research-backed guidelines for staffing levels has to do with things like how many kids is a national norm for a special educator to have as a caseload. How many kids is a national norm for a multilingual teacher to have as a caseload, or a speech and language pathologist, because none of these class size policies or the EQS address that in any way. So we pulled in some studies around what do national organizations say, or what does research say in these areas in order to ground us in something when we're looking at the number of humans that we're employing for positions like those. So another priority is we need to allow for professional learning and equitable and inclusive classroom instruction, as Jess just went over very briefly before this presentation. That's a priority for us. We have to maintain professional learning money in order to do that for our kids. We need to sustain safe facilities. We just had a good conversations in the finance committee meeting around just this, around our facilities and how do we fund needed improvements for our facilities. We know that it is a community value to ensure the continuation of co-curricular activities for our students. And that's anywhere from athletics to drama and music to after-school enrichment opportunities for kids. We know that's a commitment this district has made, and it is also one that our community values highly. We need to develop a budget that's fiscally responsible for our taxpayers. That means when we look at how to do this, we need to explore all of our systems for efficiencies. Are there places that we have just traditionally had things and people and systems going, because that's what we've always done, that we could do differently in a more efficient manner? We want to ensure financial coherence across the buildings. We're not going to save too much money by looking at our building budgets because it's just not that big of a budget line item, but there are some areas where one school is spending significantly more than another school, and we just want to know why. Is there a reason for that? Is there something in that budget line that we don't know about? Or is it just because that's how it's always been? So we're looking at literally every line in our budget right now to ask those hard questions and to ensure this financial coherence and that we know exactly what's in each of those lines. And we need to protect our services that's dedicated to our most vulnerable children and families. So as we talked about earlier, a level funded mental health budget at the state level for multiple years in a row makes a responsibility on the school system to provide those services. So we need to protect those services because they're not going to get them anywhere else. And that's not okay for kids and families. So these are administration recommended priorities to the school board. And now it's up for board discussion. Before we get into that, just so I don't forget, just a reminder that the next meeting we'll be talking about our overview of the communication and engagement plan with our community. Talking about opportunities, our plan and actions we want to take. And as you think about our next meeting, be thinking about what data or information does the board need going into this budget season to make some good decisions. But now I would love to open it up for board discussion.
Yeah, no, I think for that, Libby, super informative. Yeah, so discussion again, as Libby said, information we need, thoughts on the priorities, kind of other things that we would like to have guide us as we go into this process.
I'm curious how the additional students and the revenue associated with them balances against the 5.2 increased status quo budget. So is that meaningful? The additional revenues that would come from the 20 extra students this year, is it not meaningful when it comes to a sort of bottom line impact on?
We won't know that for a little while because we get that number from the state. And all joking aside, it does matter what type of student it is. If it's a if it's a typical elementary school student, we don't get a whole on, like that's not a weighted value. If it's a typical functioning secondary student, we get more, right? So it really depends on who those kids are to be able to answer that question. And we won't know that until we get our equalized weighted pupils from the Agency of Education, which we generally get on near.
So that seems like a good question to put under what data does the board need?
Yeah, the administration needs that data too.
Yeah, but it could just so we bring it back.
Yep.
Then in a future meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's, it bears repeating that we don't even have firm numbers until oftentimes after we have to make a decision.
Right.
Yeah.
Come up here, Christina.
The community can't hear you if you're not in front of the microphone.
So equalized pupils, we usually get 4 or 5 drops.
We've
historically gotten the final draft in January, right before you're approving your budget, so it's always a moving target.
And then the other moving target is the dollar yield opt-in, although it doesn't change that much. Usually in a typical year, it's changed a lot last year.
Yeah, after last year, I have no predictions there.
Maybe, I'm also interested in per pupil spending more than budget total. And I know that we definitely have final numbers for FY '25 using long-term weighted ADM. Maybe for FY '26, like we could have an estimate, like if we know that our counts in October are up by 20, we could just apply some ratio, like, our ADM last year was something compared to our long-term weighted ADM, so we'll assume the same, while we're waiting for AOE to prepare it. Did that make sense? Like an
I was
estimate
just-
of our.
Honestly, the thought going through my head right now, Jake, was I love math guys who are like, oh, you just apply a ratio. And I was like, I hope Christina knows what he's referring to, which I'm sure she does.
Yeah, like a ballpark.
Yeah, I'm anticipating the first draft of the budget, that first meeting in December, that will have some equalized pupil number by then.
Okay.
So,
Oh, we would have from the AOE.
yeah, so we could get, the budget presentation down to the step of the ed spending per long-term weighted average daily membership.
So
And we would have that compared to last year's,
Mhm.
which would be rooted in the smaller number of butts and seats than we have this year. I'm just trying to follow the logic of.
It'll be large, it's
More.
more. So I,
Right,
it's gonna,
Yeah, I know, I was saying last year's would be
Yeah.
small. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. We're all
oh,
saying the same thing.
okay. Yes.
And we better be able to compare, because last year we were kind of doing apples and oranges with the change.
Oh,
Yeah, we
right.
were doing apples to oranges with the dollar yield.
Yeah.
This year, it should be apples to apples.
So even though last year was the first year of this new weighting, I think one of the slides where you had like our budget over the course of the last 5 or 6 budget years, adding the per pupil spend, adding a column that's per pupil spending associated with each of those years, I think is helpful in communicating to our community, like what we actually, like what we have control over as a board, as I understand it, is per pupil spending, right?
education spending, yeah.
And so if we can say, this is our per pupil spending over the last 6 years, granted, with the asterisks that last year we had this new weighting. I think that would be a helpful piece of information.
I'm interested, this is putting the board on the spot, but I'm interested in the board's perception regarding where we should try to come in at for our first draft.
For ed spending per.
I don't have a number, but conceptually, I think for a first draft, I love what you're saying about finding efficiencies and being really thoughtful in that respect, and would love to see any of those ideas that you think are valuable. But I think I'd prefer not to see like aggressive cuts or anything in an initial draft. I'd like to see what the administration team thinks is the right fit for the district, without kind of working towards a target that may have like too aggressive cuts or anything. I think I'd like to see the picture of the need first.
I just saw your concern.
Yeah, Mira?
I don't want to disagree, but I think it'd be great to see a lot of different options, because last year there was a healthy amount of panic, and I think, or unhealthy amount of panic, and
It's unhealthy for my health.
it's not healthy for any of us, nothing. And so I feel like we were not able to look at as many possibilities as it would be nice to be able to discuss when we have like a full timeline without the like
Changes.
oh my god, Act
Yeah.
27. So like obviously I do not want to cut anything because I think everybody in these buildings does awesome work. But I do worry that with the health insurance increasing so much and all these other pressures that I'm looking at right now, that we won't be able to make a budget that will pass without making cuts. I really hope that we can find a way, but I think it would be good to see a lot of different possibilities for finding new ways to make systems more efficient, but also just different possible outcomes of this, because I would like to be able to discuss a lot of them with the time that we do have this year.
Other thoughts?
Other thoughts?
Other,
So are you asking for a number of presentation options?
Okay, a few
That would be great.
scenarios is what I hear.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
I'm wondering for the first draft of not looking at specific reductions, because that causes panic and crisis, which may not need to be caused, but rather looking at if we were to reduce by this number, this is the outcome. If we were to reduce by this number, this is the
If we
outcome.
were to remain level funded with no
This
reductions,
is the outcome.
this is the outcome.
Yeah.
Okay,
And how
very
is-
big picture numbers you're saying.
Very, but yeah,
And how is that different from a panic perspective?
because if we say we will be cutting 2.0 FTE from MREA and this is where it's coming from, and then it causes people to start getting very nervous.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know that I see, but if you show two different scenarios, and the first question is where the cuts coming from.
Mhm.
And.
Yeah. Yeah,
that is essentially, I'm
Yeah.
having deja vu of what we did last year. It was like a certain section of the cuts were coming from, I remember like one of your presentations,
Yeah.
like a bit of it came from transportation, a bit of it from salaries and benefits.
could
And
you
then we
be-
were wondering, okay, well, what do you mean by all that? But
yeah, and it's one of the reasons why we have, sorry, Mia. I
no, that's
totally
okay.
interrupted you.
Scott, I just wanted to make sure Jim saw it. Scott is saying that.
It's one of the reasons why. Shoot. We did kind of like, how is our budget broken up?
Yeah.
Right, that slide, which I'm looking at and you guys can't see. Hold on 1 second. Because like the board and the administrator, like this is what we have control over, right? This is not our entire budget. This is what we have control over. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to put this out there right in the get-go, right in the front.
So I guess my question is, could you make one of the scenarios general enough that if you said something like, we have discussed it and there might be 2 to 3 positions.
Yeah.
Across the board,
Yeah.
Across the district.
across the district.
Yep. we can
You
do
know,
that.
so that way you're not saying like, if we cut the 2 underwater basket weaving teachers, then.
Which we don't have, Tina,
Yeah.
not a position. Not a
Which is why I said it.
Just want to make that clear.
Yeah, so that way, no one looks at it, and be like, oh, that's me.
Yeah.
Right.
When they don't necessarily
Need
have to
it.
feel that.
Yeah,
Isn't the figure on slide 11, isn't that kind of the budget with no additions or reductions already? Are we looking
which one are
at
you
it?
looking at?
Probably
Oh,
not three.
this
There we
one?
go.
Yeah,
Yes, this is the budget with no addition and making some assumptions with negotiations.
okay. So are you asking us for the next meeting? What, like, and is 5 point, like, what would you like us to do from here?
So the question really is this what you want to see in the first draft? Our best assumptions of what that budget's going to be with no reductions and no additions. Or I think as Miriam was suggesting, yeah, show us that budget and then give us some, like, show us what reductions would be or additions would be if we want to make additions too. If you add $100,000 to your budget, what's it do to the overall percent increase? What's it, you know?
Okay, I'm very interested in per pupil spending most of all, because that's where the rubber hits the road. And I know that at the state level, some people have stated that a 5% per spending increase is like doable, you know, the ed fund could absorb it, and like, you know, the policymakers will meet you halfway. I forget what the wording was, but like, to me, that seems like a reasonable target. We might be below
We've
that.
never
right now.
thought of, yeah, have we thought about it in that way?
No, but for reference, going from FY 24 to 25, the ed spending for long-term weighted ADM was 3.29.
From 24 to 25.
Yeah, what we passed this year. So it was below the 5%, if that's
Oh,
target.
Because they, sorry, is that because they calculated FY 24 long-term weighted ADM for us? And it,
Yes.
Yeah.
and it only
Yeah,
went up
we-
3.9, it only went up 3.29.
Mhm. So there's lots of
Just
things
so
that we
many
compare.
factors,
So we
yeah.
compare the general budget, you know, was a 6.8% increase. And then ed spending was a 5.36% increase. And then you get down to the ed spending per pupil, and that was 3.29.
And still came in as a 15% tax increase.
15.5 for Montpelier and 5.17 for Roxbury.
Yeah, also, our penny discount is not gonna be 8 cents next year, it's gonna be something bigger. Because
more
of
about
that,
that.
because of
Yeah, that
the,
made no sense to me.
what?
I said that flew right over my
Yeah,
head.
tell me more about
Yeah.
that.
Because of the changes to CLA and yield using statewide adjustment, we have to adjust penny discounts too, or else the math doesn't work. So it's gonna be penny adjustment divided by, or the penny like divided by the statewide adjustment. So instead of 8 cents, it's gonna be, I don't know, 10 cents again or something.
When's everybody gonna know about that?
December 1st letter.
Right now.
Ah, okay. Thanks, Jake.
You get a sneak peek or whatever it's called.
Can you give us a reminder of when that gets factored into the equation?
Yeah, so you take your per pupil spending, divide by the yield. That's your school district tax rate. And then you subtract your.
Oh, right at the end, right at the end.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
and then
nice.
there's
Before
that.
the
And then
CLA.
it gets
Oh,
adjusted by 10
pre-CLA, okay.
CLAs.
Yeah, it's before the CLA.
Interesting.
What else is the December 1st
I
letter?
know, anything else you want to share, Jake Feldman?
I don't
Yeah,
know.
so December 1st is a ways
It's gonna
away.
be a gnarly one.
I am the luckiest business manager in the state.
I know, I know. She's not being facetious on that either.
So I heard an expression the other day that level programming, instead of we've been saying, I'm hearing people refer to it as level funding, right? But if the projection that you included, right, that's what, 5 point whatever%, right? That's not level funding, that's
Right.
increasing funding, but it's level programming. It's
Yeah.
no cuts or no
Right.
additions or cuts to
Right.
Right, our
what we're
staffing.
providing. And so I do think it's helpful to not say, when we want to say level programming, to say that instead of level funding. Again, thinking about how we communicate. And there was and I really like that as a starting point, right? Like if we keep as we're going, what's it gonna be projected for next year? And then maybe what are the impacts of certain potential changes to the budget, right? So in the past, like you've said, adding a person or taking away a person is 100 and whatever thousand,
20,000, yeah.
so we can understand we have this level program budget, and then as we do X, Y, and Z, what it might potentially do to that.
Yeah, a teaching position now is about $100,000 to $120,000, depending on the teacher.
That's true. Okay.
It's
Well,
the average.
Yeah, what I do is go right to the center of the salary schedule, and then I do either a 2-person or family plan.
65% of our teachers are at the end of the scale, which is a great thing. We have veteran teachers. It's fantastic.
It's also extremely expensive.
And it's also expensive.
So is there any thought to buyouts again? or-
Yeah, Christine and I have talked about that.
Yeah, I think, like Scott was saying, I would love to hear more about, I don't know, maybe this shows how much of a, not a math person I am, but the numbers, I would love to know as much as you can tell us without inspiring panic, what those numbers, what those number cuts look like in our systems. Because I also know that a cut of a certain amount of money from one department or one school might look a lot different from one from another. And I don't know how much it's the board's place to make those decisions, but I think those are good things to talk about as well. Obviously, again, I don't want us to have to make cuts, but if we do, it'd be good to know what the impact of that is going to be on specific systems and student experiences.
Libby, I was looking at that, one of the last slides where you had the priorities. And what struck me is, as I was reading through that checklist of priorities, like that's everything, right? There's like everything that we do in this district is a priority. Right, and
Yeah,
so,
there's not a lot of fluff.
yeah, so it's like, all right, not to do this now, but like, could you even go through and say, all right, well, what are the things that we're doing that are not in that priority list? And I mean, I think that goes to your point about schools are being asked to do more and more.
Yeah, we're looking closely at our class size policy at the national averages for certain things, and we're above them in many areas. So there are places that I think we could look at that wouldn't hurt any of these other priorities. Wouldn't change the student experience a tremendous amount. So there are most definitely places that we have identified that we're asking questions about right now. So the way one of the things I learned last year from the process that we didn't really have time to do last year was to ask the questions. Could MRPS do this? What would be the predicted ramifications that we need to think about? The good and the bad, right? Like all choices have consequences. So could we function this way using this amount of personnel? Could we function this way using this amount of, like, we're asking all those questions right now. We're getting initial feedback that I'm having from the whole group, which was done via quiet brainstorming. So one voice couldn't overtake others. And everybody's voices were heard for me, right? So we did quiet written brainstorming around about 9 of those questions the other day. I have all of those notes. I've written them up for people to look at, to see what everybody said. And then I'm having one-on-one conversations more specifically with leaders to see, as they've been able to let those ideas percolate in their head, what else have they thought of? And it's not necessarily whole positions. It might be like, could positions function and do the work they need to do in a different schedule, that kind of thing. So it's wide ranging, but we're really going at this with a much different mindset and process than we have in the past. So when any decision we bring to the board will not have been made lightly or with little time, like we've thought about them.
I'm glad you brought up that list of priorities. Libby, can you get it back up on the
Yeah.
screen again, and for folks who are watching at home, because that's the recommendation from the administration. We as a board could say, I am not suggesting this, but you know what, deprioritize safe facilities for now. And actually, we want to see a budget that has a higher priority of being fiscally responsible than having safe facilities. So that is another thing, or we could say as a board, these look really good to us. Yes, use these priorities when you're having those conversations, but today would be the day for us to share that, vocalize that. If there's something on there that you disagree with, or there's something you think is missing, this is the day to say that, because what I hear Libby saying is that these are, this is what they're recommending to us, and also saying, here's how we're thinking about this right now in these very early stages.
It makes sense to me.
I mean, I think another thing to think about is that we had federal money that added positions that moved into the full budget. And some of those positions were originally not gonna, they were, maybe they were time limited, or they were, I don't know, there was some discussion that they would be time limited, that they wouldn't become part of the full budget. And or that they would have a sundown or sunset on them. And we want a flywheel to spin, so I don't know if there's a way that any of that,
Yeah,
is that too specific?
no. I hear what you're saying. Some of those positions, the positions that I recall most that we were hoping, anticipating, predicting of a sunset would be our rise, thrive, shine positions for our high intensity, low incident mental health needs. And we still need them.
Yeah.
We still need them. So that is part of the challenge. Like, it's part of the challenge when I testified at the legislature last year, when people talk about just that, right? That we added positions using federal dollars, and we kept those positions because the need hasn't gone away. So just because the federal dollars doesn't go away, the need doesn't go away. So until other areas in the state are attended to, I keep harping on mental health, as I'm speaking to the choir right here around that topic. We need to continue to support our kids and families and keep them in school, because that's the place they belong, right? We need to offer the support in order to keep them here, which is way more intensive than a typically functioning kid.
Are there cost offsets for any of these types of things? Grants and or like, what if pre-K was a full day program? Could it pull kids in from the region and create a revenue source?
It would only
or-
make sense if they changed the weights for a pre-K child. Right now, a pre-K child is half a kid. Sounds awful to say, but that,
In the
it
weight.
doesn't, yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Well, they are quite small.
Yeah, I invite anybody to be in a room with 15 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds at the same time. No, I know.
Libby, I'm wondering if there's a way, I think the things on the list are great, and I'm wondering if there's a way to prioritize them so that when the board's thinking about, from your perspective as the overseer, what are the most important things on that list? And if we have to think about budget cuts, where should we maybe look?
I'd say they are all, as Scott said earlier, important. The smaller, the indents are what was, me and Jim gave feedback on this before. Those were parameters for reductions before.
Okay.
So if we were to make reductions, for instance, in faculty, we would abide by our class size. That would be one place that we would be looking to see where could that happen.
Mhm.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
If we were to make reductions elsewhere or in staff, we'd be looking at our systems for efficiency. that we could do similar work with less humans.
Mhm.
Or could we do it, we made the decision a few years ago, to remove a position that had to do with data and student data because we outsourced it for much less money. Outsourced it to a company for much less money. Are there areas that we can do that?
Mhm.
I see Monty's hands up.
I really see how these things are important and I see why they're recommended. But I'm also like looking at this list and feeling like there's a lot on there. And if there's a way to, I don't know if consolidate is possible because I see that there's already efforts to do that. But if we do have more time to think and talk about this, I wonder how we could maybe take a little pressure off some of the either priorities or the need to like start making these decisive decisions if we're still like having these conversations before the first draft is due in 2 weeks.
Well, we're not gonna see a first draft in 2 weeks, right?
We're gonna
Right.
keep talking about it in 2 weeks.
We're gonna talk about, no, we're gonna be talking about communication in 2 weeks. So the first draft, and this is super drafty, the first one, it often changes significantly from the first to the third or fourth draft that the board sees, is on the first December meeting. So it's not next meeting, it's the first December meeting. And it's like, I mean, there's numbers we don't have from the state yet, or we don't know a lot then, so we're making a lot of assumptions in that first draft, so it changes significantly. Where the board needs to, like, where the rubber meets the road is the January meetings, where decisions really have to be made. So all through that, you all will be giving me feedback and Christina feedback as to what we want to do.
I don't do this to make things harder for teachers I'm looking over, but is there a way to put together a number that would be reflective of a different classroom size policy? Or a policy that was closer to the national average or something like that? Like, is that a sort of number or a framework that other board members would be interested in seeing from a very high up level?
Do you mean change our class size policy?
Yes, like if it were closer to the national average, what might that do for the overall budget? And would that be something that other board members would be interested in seeing, just as a comparison?
I think that's a good question. And I think national average is one data point for us, but what I'm hearing is our educational quality standards is something for our state. It's like the requirement of the state. So I don't think our class size policy, we want to deviate from that too far. And I think right now they're pretty close.
They're pretty close. I have the exact language in the policy monitoring document where
Yeah.
it's different.
There's also, it's, the legislature
They may talk about it.
they may talk about
It
it.
gets really tricky because talking about staff per pupil, which staff,
Yeah,
that
yeah, and I don't want to.
it gets super tricky.
Just trying to think about different ways of looking at what different structural budget, what it might look like.
I mean, I think I don't know about this cycle, because I think it does need to be thoughtfully and done thoughtfully, and I don't know if we have time to do it thoughtfully, but I think as we look maybe for years out, I think looking at class size policy, especially if the state does not do it, makes sense, but doing it with input and with time.
And just to put my 2 cents in as a longtime educator, our class size policy isn't that too far off
Yeah.
from what a good class size policy should be. Like, I would think it's a pretty reasonable class size policy. Coming from my third year of teaching where I had 40 first graders in my room.
Yeah.
You know, so New York City, and then 40 fourth graders the next year.
There's also like a mathematical limitation, like just being a smaller district. Where if you want to offer some course, like there just may not be 22
Yeah.
or whatever
Yeah.
kids
Yeah.
who can take that course. So what are your options there? Like, do you not offer that course? Do you blend them in with some other class, which is vaguely related, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a sacrifice.
And-
But where,
and-
like in some other big district in, you know, like Chicago or something, they may have different factors
Yeah.
that they can
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah, and Jason and crew here at the high school in particular, because that really influences the high school more than the other buildings. A little bit middle school, but mostly the high school. Jason and crew are looking at that right now.
Yeah, and some other things kind of on that side too. I mean, obviously, you know, there's the merger conversation, which we hope to have going, but even kind of short of that, you know, perhaps looking at nearby schools, and because a lot of the smaller classes tend to be in the high school, and seeing if there's a possibility just to do, you know, some sort of combined classes for certain classes.
Libby, I'm wondering, of course, the policy tells us ideal, but it doesn't tell us what we actually have. And I'm wondering,
Which might be a nice segue into policy monitoring.
But we
Because
also
it's in
have
the
but
policy
fiscal- we also have
monitoring.
the
Let me
fiscal
finish.
reports.
Oh,
so
no.
I'm curious about how close we are to the numbers in here. Like, do we have a number of classes that have few students in them?
Yeah, so it's in your policy monitoring document.
Oh, I'm looking at the table, but.
We have two things before that, right?
Yep.
I'm also wondering, like last year, we were originally looking at the implementation of the new weights over time. And so I'm also wondering if it would be worthwhile to sort of say, what would a flat, is it too hard to predict 2 years out? Like if it was flat, are there too many variables to say?
Level programming, is that what you're
If
saying?
everything was level, yes, or, you know, if we were at the plus 5.2 in 27 or whatever years we're looking at, I get confused about the actual years.
Yeah, so you're ahead.
27, you're correct.
You're right.
Yeah. If it remained flat, could we predict that, is it too many factors because of the,
I'd
because the
say once,
legislature's getting their, may or may not get their hands dirty there? I
yeah, it
don't know.
depends what the commission does and what the legislator does with
They'll
it,
come up with another study and another commission.
probably. And it also depends on negotiations too.
Right.
That's a factor that we weren't considering as flash. So yeah, there's a couple of factors. We could try to put that out there, but it would be super estimating.
Really high.
Yeah.
Other comments or questions? You think you have the guidance you need for
Yeah.
round two? Okay.
If anything else comes in the board's head, shoot me an email.
Yeah.
Give me a call.
So I have votes, the finance committee, fourth quarter FY report, or fiscal year 24 fourth quarter report, and fiscal year 25 first quarter report. Turn it over to whoever wants to talk to the finance committee, and it sounds like we need to perhaps approve those.
Our chair just left.
No,
He'll be back.
we'll be back.
You guys want to give an overview?
Without my mouth full.
Jake's just sitting there quietly. He's letting you suffer.
Perfect timing.
Who is? You're on the spot.
You ready to make your motion?
Yeah. Sorry.
We're on.
Moving on
to
to
the-
just financial reports.
Yeah, the finance committee, you guys haven't talked about it. All right, the finance committee just met. We reviewed last year's unaudited financials as well as FY 25 first quarter financials. very fortunate to have Christina overseeing the district fisc and providing an overview. A couple things that I guess I just highlight that I thought were good news. I mean, at a high level, no real concerns were reported for either fiscal 24 or the start of fiscal 25. We talked about a few different pieces. Rhett, there's one thing you talked about other revenue, and I guess I didn't really realize this, but we do derive over $100,000 of revenue from students who want to come to our district. And that's unexpected over what was budgeted for. So both in fiscal 24 and 25, that's a good news revenue picture to the tune of over $100,000. Christina, I guess I'll ask you, I don't know, there is one tweak in a formula on the fund balance page. So I don't know if you wanted to articulate what that is to the board, because that's just the one piece before we move approval that I think it bears noting.
The correction.
Yeah.
Yeah, so please note on the fund balance page, there's an error in my formula. The MHS track project where it says 162,000, that should be the original committed amount of 400,000. And that's the third page of each report.
Oh, both of them. Okay.
Yeah.
Say the number again, please.
So under the committed fund balance for the MHS track project, the 162,000 needs to be 400,000.
Oh, okay. I see it.
The original committed.
And so it reduces the unanticipated unreserved to about 2.5.
Yes, and I'll be sending out a corrected version.
Got it.
In the morning.
Does that also then change the amount over 2% limit? That number would change as well, right?
That's
Yeah.
relevant to the budget, 2% budget.
Right, but if what
Oh,
is
the amount
currently
over, yes.
3.22?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So that'd be 1.9.
Yep.
on that,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And good news too from last year was that I guess we had put 400,000 we reserved for the from the fund to utilize in 24, and we only needed to use $240,000. So that's good. What else? I'll look to colleagues in the finance. I think the insurance funds and FEMA funds have come through in a way that has met expenses. So that was a good news story. So I thought it was a good report. It was very well presented, really appreciate it. And so with the revision articulated by Christina, I would move approval of both the fiscal 24 and the first quarter fiscal 25 financial reports.
Second. Any discussion or questions for finance committee or otherwise, Mia?
I have a couple of questions, maybe for the committee, maybe for you, Christina. Tim, I think I just heard you say we have been fully reimbursed for the costs of that we incurred from the 2023 flood. Yeah, and then
100% darn close, right?
okay.
There's a few thousand for not providing insurance.
Okay, so that's just really interesting to think about as we consider a future where more flooding will occur. And this building, obviously, there's lots of reasons to worry about flooding this building, but we didn't have to, like, it wasn't a big drain on our budget necessarily financially. There's a lot, like I said, a lot more that goes into recovering from a flood than just the finances, but it's just interesting to note that. And I don't know, does that mean that would be the same case in the future? We're not sure, but that's.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we qualify for FEMA again.
Yeah. Okay. I noticed the general ed line item is in the first quarter report, we've spent 67%. Is that normal?
So I've changed a little bit about how I'm reporting. What we're doing now is encumbering all of the salaries that are contracted, so we can get a better idea of the year-end projection. You're used to seeing this quarter compared to last year's quarter. I feel like a more helpful report for the board is to see how we're going to end the year and start doing planning for the year end.
Got it. Okay.
So Mia, I asked almost the exact same question, and I think the key word there is contracted, right? Because is it the non-contracted employees you can't encumber? Is that what was your answer? Because your answer made a lot of
So our
sense.
software won't let us encumber hourly
That's
paid
okay.
employees,
Okay.
so it does look like we have a big balance there. We are planning to spend all the salary and benefits. It just helps us give a better projection.
Got it. Okay. I also noticed that our budget in FY '24 includes anticipation of $30,000 in interest payments, but we only earned 22,000. And then we also are anticipating $30,000 in interest payments in the FY '25 budget. But we have a smaller fund balance. So as we plan FY '26, maybe we should probably plan for less than
Yes.
30,000. I
was
mean,
gonna
I
be one of my
realize this is
recommendations.
$8,000 in a $32 million budget is probably not.
Yeah,
the-
but as you
but-
mentioned, we do have a shrinking fund balance, so
Yeah.
our interest is not returning like we thought.
And then my last question is more of a request. I saw that we didn't have any numbers in the first quarter for enrichment income, which makes sense, because we hadn't recorded that yet. But it is something that I think we want to be paying attention to as we build the budget of the enrichment that we offer. We do ask caregivers to pay for some of that. We have the sliding scale at the middle school and at RVS right now for the enrichment that's going on in both places. And I think it would be helpful for the board to see because it is a cost and an investment of the district in co-curricular and enrichment, what also are we getting as revenue there, just as we think about next year's budget? Could we see, even if it's not in a fiscal quarterly audit, report, but if we could just have that number.
Sure. Did you notice the enrichment revenue line? So it's reported for FY '24, but like you said, FY
Right.
'25, we haven't seen.
Right, and
anything
I don't
yet.
think we're gonna see, will we see a second quarter report before we finalize the budget? Maybe we will.
I can probably make that happen.
Just if we don't actually see the second quarter finance report, which would have that line filled out,
Sure.
if we could still have that, what are we getting in revenue currently so far this year would be helpful for us to know.
Yeah, we'll be able to have projections.
Yeah. Quarter two is not till February. So we won't have the full report, but if we could just have that as we think about the co-curriculars and the enrichment that we're offering. Thank you.
Any other questions?
There was also the financial management, sorry, if folks have questions on the financials, I just didn't want to lose the financial management
Oh, right.
questionnaire.
Oh, I think we need to,
Okay.
do we have a motion? So we need to
Well,
vote on it.
the one question is it says other after-school revenue budget, 120,000. That's for both the middle school and the RVS programs.
Well,
Is that's what I was hoping to
Right,
get as revenue
in this year.
in the whole year. Just understanding. Not part two.
No,
Separate.
part two is
That's separate,
Okay.
right?
All's in favor of approving for the two financials?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? And then do a motion for the management questionnaire. Do we need a motion for that or just need to be aware of it?
Please make that motion.
Oh, great. Motion made, second. Discussion, questions, comments, editorials, pontifications. All's in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
There are some funny questions in there.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Christina.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you, Christina.
Do you want to do the Roxbury Village survey?
That to me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the board has an overview of sorry, looking at it. Helpful. the board has an overview. Let's see if we can make this bigger. Of the survey that was conducted. Just a little background, the merger document is linked in there in case anybody is interested in that. 293 community members filled out the survey. This is the results of that, 67.9%. Leaned toward MRPS offering the building to the town of Roxbury for $1 as stated in the merger agreement. And these were just, what I did was I took all the survey responses, which there were 94 of them. And of course, people, when they're responding to an open-ended question, didn't just say one thing in their comment. Some people did, but often there are 3 different ideas, for instance, in one comment. So just keep that in mind, that the percentages doesn't exactly equal 10% of 94. So I just kind of did a really simple tally mark of just big themes that came out. Slightly less than half of the survey participants, I think it was 48%, so just slightly below the 50% mark, reiterated the idea of selling or giving the building back to the town of Roxbury for a variety of reasons, some of which didn't want to spend more money on the Roxbury Village schools, some of which thought that it was the right thing to do to give to the town of Roxbury. And that the community uses were the best thing for that building, and only the citizens of Roxbury could make that decision. So there are a multitude of reasons that people presented there. Less than 10% of the respondents stated a desire to have the citizens of Roxbury decide, because it influences them most, that they didn't have enough information to weigh in. And there's a desire to unmerge the 2 towns. Approximately 5% of the respondents stated that there was a definite understanding for the need of after-school activities in Roxbury, a desire for MRPS to run a community center for the town and the building, a desire to give the citizens of Roxbury more time to develop a plan for the building. So those were the overall themes that I pulled out that were, over or near 5% at least. There's some other random comments as well that didn't fit in one of those buckets, but those were the main buckets that I took from it, keeping in mind that it's what I took from it, and that's my, I pulled out, and somebody else might have other perspectives of what people said.
Thank you, Libby.
Any questions or comments on that? And again, we'll take that up at 16.
I think our hope is to
Yeah.
have a
The vote.
full conversation on the 16th and ideally make a decision as to between, so right now the board is weighing, those are the three options that were in the survey are the ones that the board says are still on the table.
Yeah.
So.
And
the
again,
20th.
the survey is
The 20th,
informational,
right.
is not, that is not a determinative. We're not gonna.
Right, we're taking the,
It's a feedback.
it's a way that we've asked the community to engage with this decision-making process. And I would encourage the board to take it into consideration just the same as we got all the community feedback from when we were in Roxbury, the different questions we asked Libby to look into, the questions we asked the lawyer. So some of those influenced how we got to where we are currently with the 3 options. And now we still have to make the decision, go from 3 to 1. Jim's
Jim, so I guess I want some clarification around the decision. So right now, if the board does nothing, like I guess I'm not sure we need to make a decision right away, right? We understand from the email that the town of Roxbury is going to be.
Well,
Let him finish.
that's all right. I was just gonna clarify that. I think they've got authority to go to the voters. We might want to try to have a discussion. I'm not. I think whether or not whether or not we want to offer the building to them might influence whether they do that.
I think I understand. So
So they might not go to the voters if they think we're gonna keep the school.
Tom Fraser is right in terms of the merger agreement.
Uh-huh.
What Tom said in public comment earlier, the
Okay.
steps are that the school
We have to
board
decide
decides if
first.
there's an educational use for the building.
Yeah,
Then
Gotcha.
the school district decides
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
to offer the building to Roxbury for $1. Then Roxbury gets to decide if they want to take it.
Gotcha.
yeah,
But there's a definitive 1, 2, 3.
Okay, thank
the
you.
merger
Yeah,
agreement.
so I was once again wrong. Routinely
Good,
happens.
could you ask the question?
yeah. Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, I just kind of saw where it was going. Is that Amber?
Are there any other things that board members would want to know before making a decision at the next meeting? That we could ask Libby or anybody about?
If we make the decision at the next meeting to not include RVS in the budget, would that be applied this year's budget? Like the budget we're about to decide on, or the next one?
Can I ask a clarifying question to Miriam's? The decision that we're making is not about including it in next year's budget. The decision is whether or not we want to offer it back. But
Yeah,
that could be this year or next year, depending upon some established
yeah, like
timeline.
what's the timeline and how would it affect
The
the budget?
decision is whether or not the school board believes there's an educational use for the building.
Gotcha.
That's the decision.
Okay,
If it's no, then you're kind of unilaterally also saying you're gonna offer the building to Roxbury for
Yeah.
$1.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because that's the next step in the merger agreement. As we were told, and I don't think I'm breaking any executive session rules by saying this, but as we were told, it's a real estate transaction, and so contractually, that takes time.
Mhm.
And we are not gonna let a building that is in our possession to go to shot over that, so it will take time for that transaction to take place. It's a negotiation.
Right, so if the board decides that there isn't an educational use and we offer it to the town of Roxbury, the select board or wherever we're technically offering it, if they don't take it, we would sell it theoretically, right? So if we make that decision, will the building be included in the budget?
It is my belief at this moment in time on November 6th, 2024, and I will
Yes.
hold out the right to change this statement at any future date
Yes.
publicly at a board meeting, that most likely because of the timeline of that negotiation and how long real estate transactions of public buildings take, that we will need to put some sort of money into the budget to maintain the building.
Great, good to know. Thank you.
Did somebody determine whether the after-school program is or is not an educational purpose?
An after-school program would most definitely be qualified as an educational purpose. So the decision for the board would be, is that that would be the named purpose for the building? And is it worth keeping the building for the after-school program? Roxbury, my understanding from the town of Roxbury, from speaking to the citizens there who are planning on the future of building use, a community center idea is a beautiful idea, and after-school programming is part of that idea.
Are we talking about like what we think right now, or are we doing that next time?
We're more doing that
I
next
think
time.
we're doing it next time, yeah.
Right now, we're
Before
mostly
before
saying,
Phone
are
start to
there,
like face plant.
Other information?
yeah,
from
is there
Libby?
any other information
any
you
other
would need in order to be
information,
able to make
yeah.
a decision?
No, I've already made my decision.
Great. If you want to give me a call, Jake, we can talk more.
Okay,
But
too.
don't tell us for
Yeah,
another
I
2
was
months.
like-
You have 2 weeks to sit on.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the same as it was about a month ago.
Yeah.
Oh.
So we know the episode is written, we'll be excited to hear what.
I think this was in the email shared with board members. It was kind of like sideways mentioned that there is some interest in leasing classrooms in the building next year. And so it's something that we could, if we are anticipating having the building in our possession because of the amount of time that the real estate transaction could take, if we, again, decide that we don't have an educational use and we should sell it to the town for $1, we could decide we would want to have there be humans in the building and a revenue source during that time period. So that is something that has been floated to us and seems, it's like a possibility. I definitely would not go farther than possibility because anything could happen. But that could be it could be a potential revenue source for us if we were to have the building in our possession, whether or not for the next year. So that would be another thing the board could be interested in hearing more about as part of this conversation. But I think it's still first and foremost up to us to decide whether or not we have deemed there to be an educational use for the district. And all that said, because those possibilities were floated to us, Libby asked Christina to look into what would that be like from an insurance perspective, and we were given guidance that it's not advised for the district. So that could be more of a conversation we can have after we decide whether or not we think there's an educational use for the building, but we wanted to make sure that board members had all that information, that is understandably the residents of Roxbury who want to see that beautiful vision of a community center are working very hard to make that happen. And, so there are lots of different moving pieces around our decision as to whether or not there's an educational use that the district has for the building. So just want to make sure the board is aware of all of that.
So basically what you're saying is that insurance wise, it's not recommended that we rent the space out.
Our insurance company recommended against it. And we could talk more about that at another board meeting, but we didn't want to withhold information from the board that it's just good for us to all chew on.
That's important to know, because there were a lot of questions about what that would look like. Like, would a lease carry over in the event that ownership transferred? Would it?
Certainly makes the negotiation more complicated.
Yeah, it would make it more complicated, which it isn't a bad thing to put people in the building and have a revenue source, but does it foul up the way things might go? That would be unfortunate.
No, most definitely.
Current use, vis-a-vis the insurance company.
Well, we're not renting it to anyone right now because we're running the program.
Right, and that's the key issue is the renting
I think so.
versus self-administering.
Yeah, I think in part because we have liability without control. Anything else on Roxbury? Then finally, we have 3 policy monitoring reports. B5, employee unlawful harassment. B6, class size, and C4, limited English proficiency students. Do I have a motion to approve those 3 monitoring reports?
I'll move that we approve them.
Do I have a second? Any discussion or questions about the monitoring reports? No? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do I have a second? I'll second.
Everybody fell asleep.
Uh, Take care of yourselves, everyone. It's been a rough day and probably rough times to come, so in my heart. All in favor?
I.
Aye.